When I opposed the establishment of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, in the British Parliament, when all around me they were brimful of self-righteousness, I told them the only people who will ever be tried at this ICC are black Africans and Serbians. And so far, I've been proved absolutely correct, although it may or may not be about to change. Now brimful of indignation against the temerity of Karim Khan, the King's Counsel, British Council, head of the ICC, actually issuing arrest warrants for their main ally, it may not, after all, change. Do you really believe that Netanyahu is going to be arrested, is going to appear like Slobodan Milosevic in front of the International Criminal Court? Well, of course I hope so. The question is, do you really believe so? Nonetheless, the issuing of wanted posters with Netanyahu's face on them, an Interpol alert, a clear instruction to over 100 countries, signatories of the ICC, that they must arrest this man if he turns up at their border, is a remarkable turn of events. And insofar as it means anything at all, it means that the Western countries that have allied with Israel for so long and so completely are finding it more and more difficult to do so. Even the British government of Keir Starmer, in a very mealy-mouthed British way that you'd have to be a lawyer to understand it, has said that it will arrest Netanyahu if he arrives. But the problem is he might arrive to see the weapons that we continue to sell him. How does that work? You're selling weapons to a government led by a man that you're going to arrest if he turns up to inspect the goods? What a farce Western policy towards the apartheid state has become. Of course, for the Americans, well, they've actually passed a piece of legislation entitled the Invasion of the Hague Act. They are prepared to invade and have given themselves legal powers to invade the Hague if the ICC or the ICJ, for that matter, both of which are housed within 100 meters of each other. In downtown Hague, Den Haag, they call it, they have given themselves the legal authority to go in and seize anyone who is behind the dock there, being held in the prison there, and to liberate them. A bit like Hitler did with Mussolini. Now, the reality is that the public opinion, political opinion in Western countries has moved so massively that the system is finding it difficult to cope with the contradictions therein. When Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the Intermediate Range Ballistic Missile Treaty, he cannot have imagined that he was leaving the way clear for Russia to develop intermediate range ballistic missiles so powerful and so accurate that they have stunned the world with the display this week in response to the cruise missiles, yes, cruise missiles being fired by Britain, France, and the United States inside Russia. Now, I'm quite old school. I think to myself, was there any leader of the former Soviet Union who would have tolerated the NATO powers firing ballistic missiles into Russia? And of course, absolutely they would not. And you shouldn't expect any less from President Vladimir Putin, basking in 80% approval ratings in his country, not least because of the way he has stood up to the dream of Western hegemony, the dream of invading and breaking up Russia, balkanizing it, the better to be plucked by the vultures of the international economic system. Putin isn't stalling, isn't bluffing. He means it. I was with him just a couple of weeks ago at the BRICS conference in Kazan inside Russia. I'm here to tell you, he ain't bluffing. So the question tonight is, the ICC, Russia, is the global tilt beginning to happen? You've come to the right place to discuss it here on Have It Out with Galloway. Sharmine Narwani is a good friend of mine, the founder of The Cradle, which is a must-read every day for anyone interested in what's happening in the Middle East. She is a journalist, commentator, and analyst supreme. She's the go-to for news of what's happening in the East. And I'm glad to say she joins us now. Sharmine, very lovely to see you again. Before we turn to wider matters, you're in Beirut. What's the last 24 hours in Beirut been like for the residents of the city I know and love so well?
I think a little bit of a respite, actually, from being the recipient of bombs, which still continues uninterrupted. But in the last 24 hours, yesterday in the main, Hezbollah launched hundreds and hundreds of missiles and projectiles at key Israeli cities in the north. Haifa, Tel Aviv, Nahariya, Petah Tikva. It's quite astounding. Israel has never, in all the conflicts it's had with Lebanon, with Palestinians, et cetera, has never experienced anything like what they saw yesterday. You know, we've seen projectiles go into Tel Aviv and Haifa before, but usually, you know, there is the Israeli military censor, but we have very little visuals of damage that's been done. But in the last 24 hours, we've seen, you know, tremendous amounts of damage, buildings almost collapsing, serious impacts on buildings, on vehicles. About half of Israel's population spent the last day in shelters. This has all been extremely significant. And of course, Beirut braces for what Israel will do in reaction, because as we've seen over the last 13 months, this is an, you know, unleashed beast. They don't even, they've decimated entire areas and they're still bombing them. You know, it's just a constant show of firepower, chest beating. But, you know, Hezbollah did have to react, as much as it's tried to restrain itself so that, you know, both Lebanon and Israel are not destroyed entirely in the process. They've had to respond because Israel has been hitting unconventional areas where there are no Hezbollah officials, there are no Hezbollah offices. I think Basta, which happened a few days ago, was the first of its kind, really shocked the Lebanese. They've now hit in Christian areas in Beirut, and they've hit in Sunni areas. So there had to be a response. And the new Hezbollah Secretary General, Naim Qassem, in his recent speech said, you know, if you hit Beirut, we're going to now hit Tel Aviv properly. So that's where Lebanon is right now. And of course, there's a lot going on in the south with Israel's land invasion, still trying to take territory, have not succeeded yet, have not been able to plant their flag quite yet in any village or town. They've come in, taken pictures, and mostly retreated. But there's very, very heavy clashes going on. We saw some videos for the first time. Some of these clashes are at zero distance. Others are, you know, Israeli air bombing towns that they can't take over. And Hezbollah, of course, launching their projectiles at groupings of Israeli soldiers and tanks. I think to date, Hezbollah has taken out 60 Israeli tanks in 50 something days. So significant.
Yeah, 64 Merkava tanks have been destroyed, and many of them in the last 48 hours. Hezbollah launched 49 operations yesterday, definitely a record. I'm not sure, actually, if in the entire history of the Arab-Israeli conflict that Israel has ever seen anything quite like this, though I may be wrong about that. There's talk in the air of ceasefire. If that turns out to be the case, it will be portrayed, and even if it isn't portrayed, will be understood as a very significant victory for the Lebanese resistance. Do you think there is going to be one? And if so, will it hold?
I wouldn't hold my breath on a ceasefire. I mean, we keep getting hints from various sources that the ceasefire negotiations are now in its final phase, and that a deal is imminent. But when I look at what Israel has to gain and lose from this, I suspect that the Israelis will not, Netanyahu in particular, will not sign on to this agreement. Right now, he's getting bashed by Israelis left, right, and center, including his opposition, including other members of his party, and certainly, right-wing extremist members of his coalition, like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who will break his coalition if there is a ceasefire. They've said so. They've said as much. So he's under a lot of fire internally on this. To be honest, it's the Israelis, I think, who need the ceasefire more, because they've never experienced this kind of war launched inside their territory. And I don't know, as you say, if this particular salvo or the salvos of the last 24 hours were the first of its kind in the various Israeli-Arab wars. But I do know that Israel has never, ever experienced a war of attrition like this. 13 months on, this is a country of maximum 9 million people. They don't have enough soldiers or reservists. Some of their reservists have been in play for over 200 days or more. They're exhausted. They've kept a cap, or they've kept quiet about the number of fatalities in the Israeli army. They've also downplayed the numbers of injured, but these injuries are severe. There's a lot of Israeli troops missing arms and legs and blind. We knew this from 3 months into the war. I can't imagine what those numbers are now. Today, by the way, we saw the first Israeli released footage of some of its injured soldiers being evacuated from a Merkava tank and helicoptered back to safety for hospitalization. They have made a great effort not to show these kinds of images. So for me, I think Netanyahu would be very frightened of a ceasefire. His coalition government is very likely to collapse if there's a ceasefire, based on the promises of his extremist ministers. And what does that do? That means Netanyahu is not a sitting prime minister anymore. And guess what? The judicial system is after him big time. It's not just the ICC, but Netanyahu has many charges against him within his own state, and his opposition wants to put him behind bars for even more things than they did before. And one of those things is this war and what happened on October 7th, which Netanyahu certainly does not want to investigate.
And Iran hasn't even spoken yet for the third time. What might happen in that, and what would the response in the region be?
It's very hard to read the Iranians. We talk a lot about their strategic patience. Of course, before and after their earlier strikes, 2 so far, There was a lot of conversation about, Iran's not going to react, and then after it did react militarily, and sorry, bombed Israel, um, people were complaining that it wasn't enough. I think it's really impossible to read the Iranian mindset on this. They have been very clear, though, that there will be a third operation and it will be more severe than the last one. Each one has been incrementally more severe. I think if Iran does act, it has to do so very, very hard, because obviously it wants to alleviate some of the pressures that its allies, Hezbollah and Hamas, have had to endure, nonstop. As you've seen, the entire leadership of Hezbollah, military and political, was decimated by the Israelis 2 months ago. So if Iran acts, I think it will be a different kind of attack than the last two we've seen. Will it be decisive? I don't know. This Israeli beast just can't get enough of conflict.
Well, the ICC, you referred to it there. Does that change the paradigm in any way? Does it represent, as I said it did in my monologue, the really quite seismic shift in public opinion in Western countries away from Israel towards the Palestinians?
Public opinion on these wars do not in the least sway Western leaderships once the decision has been made, mostly by the Americans and the British. I do think, however, the list of very obvious crimes that Israel has committed in executing its war in Gaza has been so astounding, and it's been televised. They call it the first televised genocide. We've seen it all. And I think that made international bodies like the ICC and the United Nations be unable to sweep these Western conflicts under the rug. This one in particular, just because it was so apparent what was happening. And I think because there has been a seismic shift already globally with the rise of a multipolar pole, Russia, China, Iran, and others, with the expansion of the BRICS, with the strengthening of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other institutions. I think that seismic shift was already happening, which opened the window for international organizations to start exercising their mandates. This wouldn't have happened even a decade ago. So I don't know that the ICC decision to issue warrants is causing the shift. I think the shift happened before and enabled the ICC to then move ahead with this. And it's clear that the UN Security Council is unable to pass resolutions on Israel. So the General Assembly of the United Nations has come more into play, passing resolution after resolution, of course, non-binding, unenforceable. So, with the ICJ taking the lead initially on looking at genocide being committed by the Israelis, the ICC, of course, a case was brought in front of it, and there's really no other way they could have looked at this. They had to issue warrants. But let's not forget, Netanyahu is very unpopular around the world right now. It became palatable, right? The conception that the ICC could issue a warrant against this man, it became possible suddenly. And of course, he's unpopular in Israel too, meaning there is a strong opposition. There have been attempts on his life. His wife believes that there is a military coup underway to replace him. So, as surrounded as he is, I don't think he was a difficult man to take on.
Finally, the part of the shift that's going on is visible on the ground, on the battlefield in the Ukraine, isn't it? The massive effort made by NATO to defeat Russia using the dead and broken bodies of the Ukrainians has very clearly failed. The battlefield maps are very hard to keep up with. The advance of the Russian forces so great. In a way, NATO has to make a decision very quickly, doesn't it? Is it going to stop reinforcing failure, stop sending more and more billions into the furnace, for they are quickly burned? Is it going to try and change the subject? And if it does change the subject, might that be towards Iran?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just Iran. I think China is very much in their sights as well. And I think Europe usually takes the lead from the Americans. China is very much in Donald Trump's sights. Um, so I often see the old order as sort of like a brontosaurus, small head, big lumbering body, unable to change course because the momentum is so great from whether it's interest groups or corporations or whatever. And it's hard for them to change course mid battle, midfield. So I don't, we still hear amazingly European leaders talking about victories and potential victories and possible victories in Ukraine. Are they just not seeing what the rest of us are seeing? I don't know, but I don't imagine that they will change course. In the interim, what's going to happen is Donald Trump's going to come in and there is going to be a shift in Ukraine policy. I mean, basically, Ukraine, like Israel, cannot continue executing war if it doesn't receive the weapons that the United States supplies or green lights, or arm twists out of its European partners. So I think we're at a decisive time. If it was just Ukraine we were looking at, it wouldn't be as, I think, easy or quick a transition to a new order. But with Israel right there alongside it, by the way, I think one of the other things that ICC might trigger, other than emboldening people to file lawsuits and adding more arrest warrants. So like the head of the Israeli army, going all the way down the ranks. I mean, I know there are lawsuits being looked at in the UK against British Israeli citizens who served in the army in Gaza, that kind of thing. But I think it is also potentially going to trigger or worsen what's going to happen when Trump comes in, meaning the Atlanticist arrangement, okay? This sort of rock solid alliance that has lasted through world wars and has shaped the world, because the Americans are going absolutely crazy at the very notion that any European country will arrest Netanyahu if he arrives there. People like Lindsey Graham have threatened sanctions against their European allies for doing things like this, for arresting Netanyahu or Gallant, his former defense minister. So I think we're seeing, or we'll start to see, over Ukraine and over Israel, a real shift in this Atlantic alliance, which will hasten the new order coming. And when the alliance is frayed, it'll be harder for them to take on new enemies, to be honest. They can take on Iran, but it'll be a splintered alliance that will be doing so and will never be as effective as it was in years past.
The empire as Brontosaurus, that's an image that will last. Thank you, Sharmine Narwani. Good luck with the cradle. Everyone should follow it. Well, let's go to the studio audience on the wall. First up in Sacramento, a beautiful town indeed, Sam Mirleta in the United States. Sam, what do you want to say?
Greetings from the belly of the beast, George.
Nice to talk to you.
So I wanted to ask, in regard to a possible U.S. response. The other day it was mentioned that if Russia were to respond to the Ukrainian strikes inside of their territory using ATACMS, that Russia could potentially strike Britain. And the assertion was made that the U.S. may possibly decide not to respond, which I would tend to agree with. What if
We've lost you, Sam, but I got the gist of your comment. First of all, Russia has the absolute legal right to strike any British target in relation to in retaliation for the attack on the Russian Federation by British supplied weapons, British targeted weapons, and weapons which could not, literally could not, technically could not be fired without British participation. And the open public exhortation of British and French leaders that Ukraine was free to do this with the weapons that they supplied. So legally speaking, Russia could land a rocket on the center of London. I very much hope that they do not, but they have the legal right to. My thesis that you allude to is very clear. Britain is, of all of Russia's enemies, the most hated. It's actually, in many respects, more hated than the United States, and not just by Russians. Britain is seen as the colonial slave trader of times gone by. It's seen as the tail of the dog, which often acts as if it was telling the dog what to do. It's hated on mainland Europe, hated for good reasons and for bad. They never forgave us for not surrendering in World War II when they did, folding like cheap tents in the face of Hitler's onslaught. They never forgave us for holding out against the fascist beast arraigned at the Channel ports. They never forgave us for, with our allies, landing in Normandy in 1944 to begin the liberation of the western part of Europe. They never forgave us for our conduct inside the EU, the EEC first and then the EU. They never forgave us for Brexit. They don't like us. The French don't like us, never have. The idea that France is going to launch its nuclear weapons in retaliation for an attack on Britain is for the birds, frankly. Anyone who knows France knows that France would not sacrifice itself for the British. And anyone who thinks that Donald Trump would doesn't know anything about Donald Trump, doesn't know anything about the US empire, doesn't know anything about what happened to the allies of the United States in theater after theater, from Korea to Vietnam, from Vietnam to Iran. Where did the Shah die? Who knows? He wasn't allowed into the United States to die. That is for sure. Ask the ex-government of Afghanistan that had to flee the country with bin bags full of their ill-gotten gains, and had no more, never another word was said about them after the US scuttled like a thief in the night out of Afghanistan. I could go on with many more examples. People, as Dr. Kissinger once said, being a friend of the United States, being an enemy of the United States can be dangerous, but being a friend of the United States can often be fatal. Thanks, Sam, for your call. Let's go to England. Nick Fletcher is in Malton. Go ahead, Nick.
Hello, George.
Hi.
Now that President Biden has ramped up tensions in Ukraine, how do you think Russia will respond?
Well, I really don't know. I can't speak for them, but I was with Putin just a few weeks ago at the BRICS conference in Kazan, and I'm here to tell you that just as Stalin wasn't Stalin when he told the beast of Berlin that he would crush him in his lair, Putin isn't stalling either. He's definitely not bluffing, and he has almost 20 years of evidence. He told the conference in Munich in 2007 exactly what Russia's red lines were. He repeated them over and over again, ad nauseum. He made concessions in the Minsk agreements, which were a calculated deception, upon Russia, as the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel and as the former French President Francois Hollande have both confirmed verbally, with their lips moving, to people who scammed them. But the truth that came forth was the truth, that the Western allies deliberately deceived Russia about the Minsk II agreements and used the period, as they intended to do, to build up Ukraine as a military force, the better to strike Russia with when the time was right. So I don't know what they're going to do, but I do know they are going to do. Thanks, Nick. Paul James Yoward, let's see, or is it Paul James? I beg your pardon. Paul, what do you want to say? Paul, are you there?
Yeah, hi. I didn't realize I had to unmute myself. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that Kissinger has been mentioned, buddy boy of Klaus Schwab, the other globalists of the WEF, in the context of the globalist organizations such as the UN, which have censured Israel more than every other country put together. Is it the case now that you support such fascistic organizations as the WEF, who are trying to put a sort of globalized communistic fascism across the world, with the control over yourself and everybody else through the means of halting your just freedom to go about the world, and also your finances? I mean, why should Israel take any notice of ICC and people like this when they're clearly, like the WHO, totally corrupt organizations infiltrated by the likes of Tedros? Tedros, who is a corruption. He is a literal corruption in himself, as is Schwab and his WEF organization. Why should anybody take any notice of these filth of the world?
Well, they're not taking any notice, so you can rest easy on that. The Israelis are not taking any notice at all of the decision of the International Criminal Court, because criminals very rarely respect the courts that pass judgment on them. You're talking about filth in the context of other people, but you are silent on the filth that runs the apartheid state of Israel. It'll surprise you. I agree with you. Let's fight this out. Let's deal with this kinetically on the battlefield. That's increasingly my view on all the theaters of conflict, because I think people like you have got it coming. I think people like you are cruising for a bruising. And by God, you're going to get one hell of a bruising. Christopher Sellers is in Pernambuco in Brazil. Christopher, what would you like to say?
Very appropriate to the ideology of death, which
unfortunately
you know, which
your very last year
of,
your very last year, mate. So you can get lost. We're now on to Christopher Sellers in Brazil. Christopher.
Hello, George. Hello,
yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, clearly. Go ahead.
Oh, good. Yes. Well, just to fill you in, I'm obviously an expat Englishman. I've lived in Brazil for almost 50 years, or in South America, actually. I lived in Bolivia before coming here 20 years ago. And of course, living in Brazil, I have great interest in BRICS. And I would ask you to speculate, do you think that, given the bellicose nature of the world at the moment, that BRICS will be obliged, probably through necessity, to form or agree on a mutual defense treaty. And if that were the case, what would be the speculation, of course, but what would be the result of that?
Well, it is, as you say yourself, Christopher, it is speculation upon speculation. First, I should say that BRICS is adamant that it will never be a military alliance. The way things are going, all kinds of people are going to have to join the BRICS to defend themselves against American sanctions. If you have a situation where the United States government, one of Donald Trump's closest allies, the repulsive Lindsey Graham, Mrs. Lindsey Graham, are openly threatening to crush their own allies' economies in France, Italy, and the United Kingdom now. If we're in a situation where even NATO members, even close allies of the United States are being sanctioned, are being crushed, to use Lindsey Graham's words, then all kinds of people are going to join the BRICS. All kinds of people are already in the BRICS of quite widely disparate political systems, from the United Arab Emirates to the People's Republic of China, or the Islamic Republic of Iran, or indeed the social democracy that is the Brazil that you are living in. It would be difficult to make a military alliance out of that. And frankly, the military power of Russia, China, and Iran together alone are more than enough for the empire to handle. So if we have a situation where people are joining the BRICS that precludes any of the members sanctioning the others, that's, I think, how it's going to go. What I do think will come long before the speculation that you have made is a greater rapidity of political cooperation amongst the BRICS, a big growth in membership, and not 1 year between every BRICS, but far more than that. It seems to me quite likely that a parliament, won't be called that, an assembly, a parliament of the BRICS is very likely to happen in the next 10 to 20 years, in which these matters can be discussed. Let me skip to number 8. Callum Smiles, again in England, in Shropshire, a journalist, very popular pastime these days. Callum, go ahead, my friend.
You actually remember when we had a bit of a chat at No to NATO, No to War?
I recognize your face, yes. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I used to work at Rebel News at the time, and I got in a bit of trouble in our meeting for not grilling you hard enough, apparently. But anyway, my question is, given the Israel-Gaza stuff, and you're very pro-Gaza, very anti-Israel, do you not think that actually I don't find there's enough people in, I'd say almost in the middle ground, that say that actually there's wrongdoings on both sides, and really the adults in the room should take both by the ear and, basically give them both a grilling. Do you not think that actually there's been wrongdoings on both sides and both should be held to account?
Who are the adults in the room?
Well, that's a good question.
Do you mean Joe Biden? You mean Joe Biden? Keir Starmer?
Oh, God, no, absolutely not.
Well, who are these adults?
Really, actually, Joe Public.
Who are these adults of whom you speak?
I'd say Joe Public these days, because politicians, by and large, are far from smart.
Well, how can Joe Public affect what's happening on the ground in Gaza?
Sorry, can you say that again? My signal cut out a bit there.
Yeah, you didn't learn much from our last encounter. I suggest you go and study more. There is no middle ground. You're either with genocide or you're against it. Just as you can't be a little bit pregnant, You can't be a little bit against genocide. You can't be a little bit in favor of genocide. The international courts have merely crystallized what most sentient human beings had already concluded, which was that a great crime against humanity is being committed in Gaza. A great war crime, a great crime on the scale that led to the Nuremberg trials. And moreover, we're not short of evidence, as we were at Nuremberg. The video and pictures for 14 months from Gaza are akin to the live streaming of the Holocaust itself in the Second World War. It's as if you were live streaming Auschwitz, Birkenau. It's as if you were live streaming the industrialized murder of millions of people in the Holocaust. You can't have a middle ground on that. And I'm just amazed that you think there is. Let's go to Greater Manchester. I'm often there myself, where Tanya Manzoor in Cheadle in Greater Manchester has a point of view. Lovely to see you. Tanya, what do you want to ask?
Hi, George. How are you?
All good. Thank you very much.
Nice to see you again. So my question is related to how one of the independent MPs, Shocker Adams, has recently submitted the Palestine statehood recognition bill in October, and it's due to be here 29th this week on second hearing. And 2 days after this was submitted in October, Layla Moran of the Liberal Democrats submitted their Palestine recognition bill, which at the time I was quite upset about. Initially, I thought this was an excuse not to support the independence Palestine statehood bill and play games. And further to that, this Shocker's bill will be heard on the 29th, whereas the Liberal Democrats bill won't be here till July next year, which I thought was ridiculous. So I wanted to know what your thoughts are of what the Liberals are up to. And also, this is the fourth time, I think, that Layla's been in for a bill, and her previous bills have gone nowhere. So I'd like to hear your thoughts from your experience.
Well, very good. And you're right always to be suspicious about the Liberal Democrats. Anyone who isn't, I've got a bridge in London, I could sell them. The truth is, neither of these bills can possibly go anywhere. Labour, under the grotesque electoral system that we have, based on a tiny minority of the voters of Britain, has an overwhelming super parliamentary majority of over 170. So nothing that the Liberal Democrats put forward, still less nothing that the 5 independent MPs can put forward, can, by definition, go anywhere, can succeed, but they are all useful consciousness-raising tactics. It's a bit like this petition, which I strongly support, demanding a new general election in Britain. It's got 2 million signatories in less than 48 hours. This is an enormous achievement. It's a very good thing. It will lead to nothing in the sense that it will not produce a general election, but it's consciousness raising, and it unnerves the horses in the new Labour stables and makes them nervous about what the next general election and by-elections, council elections are going to produce for them. I'm in favour of the maximum number of people affording Palestinian recognition of statehood, but that also, in concrete terms, means nothing. It's really easy for a parliament to say, we now recognise the Palestinian state, but where is it? Where is this Palestinian state that you are recognising? It doesn't make it happen because you recognise it. The only thing that can produce a Palestinian state is a complete divestment of Western governments from Netanyahu's apartheid state. That's the only way that a Palestinian state can occur. And if they mean, as I think they do, a mini state in a part of the West Bank, and now a part of Gaza, and a tiny, tiny part of Jerusalem's outer city limits, that won't fly in any case. It doesn't solve the Palestine problem, and we shouldn't pretend that it does, because we're only setting people up for a disappointment. Thank you, Tanya. Lovely to see you again. Joe Gorham is a Royal Navy veteran in Essex in England. Joe, what have you got for me?
Okay, this is moving on from the Gaza to the Russian conflict. Now, we're firing Storm Shadow missiles into Russia now. Well, you know, us and the Ukrainians. But I know we don't give them missiles to the Ukrainians out of the kindness of our hearts and charity. We obviously want something for that. Now, the question I'd like to ask you, Mr. Galloway, is if Ukraine win, what do we win? And if Russia win, what do they win?
Well, of course, we win nothing, and we're not doing it out of the goodness of our heart. You're right. We're doing it because we're the tail of the American dog, and we are determined always to show that this tail is organically connected, albeit at the backside of the American dog. We're in a competition with the French and the Italians and others as to who can be the most loyal to the American dog of war. That's why we're doing it. Our companies will not profit from it any more than we profited from our participation in the invasion and occupation of Iraq. As I suspect you know, all the contracts for rebuilding Iraq went to American companies, and America is still controlling the finances of Iraq. So what will we gain from it? Nothing, nothing, nothing. Let's go to one final caller, Andreas Koreas in Cyprus, which is, of course, now a participant in the war. Andreas, what have you got for me?
Hello, George. I'm so glad to participate again. We can talk about my country's filthy role in another episode. I'm very willing to speak about it. I believe that NATO is one of the main mechanisms of USA's deep state, and Trump promised to fight against this deep state. However, he included many deep state people in his cabinet, with those few exceptions that you mentioned last week. I supported Trump. I like the MAGA communist approach of King Cole and Samira Khan. These two are brilliant people. I also supported Corbyn, and I want to point out that even Corbyn's shadow cabinet was also almost full of liberals and Zionists and NATO supporters, including even Starmer. So I realized that these people are everywhere. The deep state is really deep, both in the USA and the UK, and even anti-war, anti-NATO politicians such as Trump and Corbyn cannot avoid working with it.
Well, I'll tell you what, Andreas, we've run out of time, but I get your drift. Believe me, I get your drift. The coming struggle for Donald Trump will be an important one, but it's important to acknowledge that we're starting about 7 goals down in that particular contest. The picking of the warmongering, ultra-Zionist cabinet that Donald Trump has already done means that the course that has been set will be an extremely negative one. There was a possibility in the beginning, and may be a possibility further down the line, of anti-NATO, anti-Israel politicians being included in the cabinet with powerful positions, but not yet. The idea that Trump can control this hydra-headed monster that he has assembled at Mar-a-Lago multi-headed, monstrous, warmongering, Israel-loving neocons that he has put together in his cabinet is fanciful. Donald Trump's good, but he's not that good. He's smart, but he's not that smart. He's certainly not better or smarter than the monsters that he has already assembled around him. I have to call it a day. I'm sorry to those who were on the wall and didn't get called. Come back again next week at the same time. I promise we'll do our best to push you up the batting order. You've been here on Have It Out with Galloway, where everyone is welcome. Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. See you next week.